Okay, so thanks, Geoff, for joining me again. It's good to see you.
Likewise.
And I feel like this is fitting because you and I had a pretty deep chat over a year ago about the methodology of materiality that I was kind of scratching out on the back of an envelope, and you were helping me kick it around and test it a bit. And I've been on a few adventures since then, trialing it on 5 different companies. You've been along for the ride.
Yeah.
And so this is a chance for you to really kind of kick the tires a little further, because the other day when you were part of a workshop, you had some really profound questions, and I feel like I put some pins in those and said, yeah, maybe we can pick those up in more detail and dig in. So this is us digging in. I'm kind of at your mercy. And thank you. Anything you want to say before I start to share my screen and see what kind of trouble we can make?
Yeah, well, thanks for the opportunity. And I think the thing that has really struck me most about your materiality work is this this highlighting of the disconnect between what companies say they do and what they actually do, or what they do in terms of trying to reduce their impacts gradually, but what they do versus what they do in terms of how they make money, how they pay the bills. And I think what would be interesting for me is to understand, how are you looking at those two sides? You know, you've mentioned investor calls before, versus just looking at sustainability reports, but I would love to get an understanding of, you know, what are those things? Where do you find them? Are you allowed to dive into them, or are they recorded? All of that kind of stuff, because I think for a lot of people in this sustainability space, they typically will go to the sustainability pages on the website, look at the sustainability reports, and maybe not have that other lens that you look through. So that would be most helpful, I think.
Cool. Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. And I think the assessment to use to highlight that, but please get me to keep digging if it's not helping, is I'm going to share my screen here and take us into the Danone assessment, which was the 3rd one that I did. So Danone being a global food company. Let me just double check. Am I sharing my screen here?
Yep, that's great. Yep.
Cool. And I'll make sure that so this is a Google slide deck. It's open. Anybody can look at it. Anybody can view it. So I'll make sure the link to this is easy to find in this video. And you can see there's quite a few slides here. This is a little thumbnail where you can see all the way to the end. So it's a 30 slide deck. Lots of different things going on here. And I'll just take us to the table of contents and highlight that I have a specific section in this assessment where I look at investor earnings calls. I didn't necessarily do that in every single assessment, but with Danone, I thought it was a very telling investor story. So this slide 10, is the investor slide. And
could you zoom in on that one a bit?
Sure. Maybe does it help if I put it into slideshow mode?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so there's a lot on here, and anybody who's watching this may just want to pause the video and like read it, because my voiceover is gonna skip quickly. But I'm gonna tell you, Geoff, what's here and how I got to it, and then I'm gonna see if you have questions, because I want to take you into the database that I access to do this. But before I do that, I'll just quickly explain what's here. So you can see across the top of these 3 columns, there's 3 different dates. Those dates refer to quarterly earnings calls that the executive of the company hold, that their investors or interested parties can dial into. And I'll show you a bit more about like, where's the, how do you find that and who's in there. But anybody can read these transcripts. So this is all public. And what I found really telling in these was the change in tone. So back in February 2020, the earnings call, at the time CEO Emmanuel Faber was talking very actively about regenerative agriculture. He mentioned it 10 times in the call. He mentioned emissions. He used the word nature, talked about plastic as, an issue that the company, single-use packaging obviously being a big issue for a food company. And he was really saying the words that matter in terms of what stakeholders need and potentially the direction of the company. And he was talking about things like soil health, really kind of grassroots. We go a year later, the same CEO has really dialed back on those words. And a year later, it's a new CEO, and those words are gone, literally, they're not uttered. And the dialogue that we could call ESG, environmental, social, and governance related, or sustainability related, starts to be really generic, like we hired a new sustainability person. So that tone really changed for me, and that struck me as quite telling.
Yeah. And did you look at the financial results of those 3 years as well? Was there any obvious link there in terms of why he might have been throttling back on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Hold that thought, because I'll take you into the database and we'll see if we can directly answer that question. Because the truth is, when I think back to that, so I did this assessment in kind of October, November 2022. I definitely looked, I tend to look at the share price and watch, like, is there a pattern? For example, in the height of the pandemic, the pattern was a lot of companies' share price went up.
Yeah.
But I don't actually recall what I looked at here. So these are all linked here. So you'll see I'm linking into a website called Seeking Alpha. And I'm actually going to just do a little 101 before going deeper here. So I'm going to hop over to this other tab. This is the kind of landing page of Seeking Alpha. And then when I type in the search, I get Danone. I can click on their ticker symbol is DANOY. And this is just kind of like a dashboard of Danone. And there's all kinds of things I can go into here. You'll notice.
Do you pay for this, or is this publicly accessible?
Yeah, good question. So I do pay for the premium subscription, and I have for years. I've been accessing this. In fact, a former colleague of ours, Michael Sadowski, whom we worked with at Sustainability, he first introduced me to this platform in, I'm going to say 2012. And since then, I've been regularly going in here, poking around. I started to pay for my subscription probably about 6 years ago. And to be honest, I find it one of my most valuable online platforms. But I believe the information I'm about to show you would be viewable to a non-paying subscriber. It might be less conveniently laid out, and I'll show you what I mean by that, but the information is still there. So this is, everything I'm about to show you is public. And an important thing to look for when I go, so I've pulled up, this is just generic. We've landed on the company's ticker symbol and what's going on. So a whole bunch of stuff here. Their most recent stock. You can like go to the 10-year picture if you want. You can go to the last 5 days. So once in a while I look at that because you'll see like, oh, what, what's going on here, and you'll notice interesting trends. But for the most part, I'm actually going to the transcripts. So it's kind of this buried little word that doesn't look very exciting, but actually is full of gold if you want to understand what's going on with the company. So I click on transcripts. So I'm now just going to pop us back over to the link to the transcript from that initial Q4 2019. So their last quarter of 2019, where they're going to talk about the whole year. And the transcript is here. And we can see it's just words. It's literally the transcript. Now, what I did here was I just clicked in here and did like a find on, for example, agriculture. And I see he's the CEO, and then others are beginning to ask about agriculture. And I just look at, so what's the context there? And then I might look for another word like soil, right? And it comes up over and over. And here we have the CEO guiding people to look at details about soil. Whereas those same keywords, if I go to fast forward by 2 years. And again, I'm going straight into the transcript, but if I were searching in the database, clicking on, I could go into any one of these more detailed transcripts.
And it looks like they have slides there as well, not just the transcripts. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Hold that thought. I'll come right back to that. I just want to show you in the more recent one. I then just did that same find on soil, nowhere. Agriculture, nowhere. Right. So those same words.
Wow.
Right. I'm just doing a keyword search, and I could do that on anything. I could, I could pick, well, what I thought was interesting is sustainability in the one where he's talking about soil a lot doesn't come up at all. But in the more recent one, it comes up 5 times. So I want to just clarify why that's interesting to me. And actually, I'd be very curious your thoughts, Geoff, that when the CEO is talking a lot about soil health, about plastics, all these like real words, he never mentions the word sustainability.
No.
But in the more recent one, those words don't come up. In fact, I don't think he mentions plastic. Oh yes, plastic is mentioned, but in the context of inflation affecting the prices. So that's the only mention, which is, a fair point to be making, but it's certainly not being referenced in terms of a waste management issue. Whereas the word sustainability is mentioned.
Yeah, it's interesting because you would expect, as a company becomes more mature on its journey to sustainability, it stops using those generic terms in favor of more specific, nuanced ones. And what we see here is he's gone backwards.
Exactly. And that's kind of what I capture in the assessment. So let's take the pin out of your question around other things that you can see just by going to transcripts. By the way, there's all kinds of other stuff. Yeah, you can go into presentations, and usually it's a deck like this, and you can view it. I can view it as a PDF. I think this is where the format, you have more options as a paid subscriber than as like anybody just logging in. And you can kind of click through. So this is where I would have, in theory, looked at the financials or kind of started to dig into some of the more kind of visual overview stuff. This is a more recent one, by the way. So this has all come out since I did the assessment, which was last year. Yeah, so you can see all this stuff. Now, just to be clear, you could find these things on the company website, right? So, you mentioned.
Sorry, is this a legal requirement for public companies that they do these and that they publish them, or did you pick Danone partly because they had a lot of this stuff available?
Yeah, that's a great question. So here's my understanding, and others may have a much more refined sense of this. First of all, the legal requirements vary jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So I know, for example, in Canada, the banks have been required for quite some time to disclose what we would call ESG information, well ahead of other sector, like non-sector peers, if you will.
Right.
And so they have been, like, there have been, ESG disclosures coming from the banks in this country for a very long time. And then I think there are some things that are mandatory across other jurisdictions. Publicly traded companies do have to disclose some things. So let's go back to that kind of dashboardy thing. You've got their SEC filings. If they're publicly listed and they're traded on a given exchange. So Danone is traded on a few different exchanges. This is where I get a bit blurry. Like, I don't totally follow who's traded everywhere. But they are traded on the New York Stock Exchange. And so they must meet SEC. They have to comply with the SEC rules, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is the authority governing the financial markets in the United States. And so they do. And so here are all of their filings that would go to the SEC. And so, by the way, if people don't want to tinker in a site like Seeking Alpha, you can. So in this site, in this assessment, I include a link to the company's website. And Danone, I would say Danone is quite transparent. They make a lot of information available. It's kind of hard to follow, but it's like, well, there's no perfect way to organize website. But here we have the investor page, and you can go to those publications, right? Dig them all up. So they're here. What makes me a little bit crazy is every company puts them in another place. Like, let me hop over to JBS for just a moment, causing some flashbacks and personal angst.
Cold sweats.
What's that?
Cold sweats.
Yeah, exactly. Where would be the best place to go here? So this one, I didn't do like an investor overview slide because it was kind of convoluted. That's an understatement. But let me take you to what would be useful here. Okay, let's just go to like a generic JBS page. So anything highlighted in red in the JBS assessment is a clickable. Come on. Sorry, definitely be editing this. It doesn't, these things were clickable before. That's weird. I'll have to pop back in there. Okay. Here is a JBS financial statement.
Okay.
No, sorry. I should have teed this up before. We'll get there. I want to just get us to a generic JBS webpage. It's funny, it's like a vacuum to my head. Why am I not finding just JBS, generic JBS? Who are you, JBS? Here we go, JBS landing page. Okay, so if we look at another company like JBS, which is a global meat and protein company based in Brazil.
Yep.
And I did an assessment on them more recently. It's also public. I'll make sure the link for that is easy to find here. It's a much longer assessment. It's formatted a bit differently than the Danone one. But what I'd like to just highlight here is to look at their investor. So this is just their sort of landing page. They have a few different landing pages. It's a little bit confusing. But if you want to look at the investor piece, you can see it's not easily right across the top the way it was with Danone. So just to go back to Danone, right across the top banner, you've got investors, and they kind of guide you in very nicely, I found. Whereas with JBS, it was a bit of a dig to get to the investor piece. It's there. Let me see if I can get us there. Yeah, so you can go down in here. Okay. Investor relations. They have some updates. Oh, that's exciting. Got a call coming up. So this, to your question, can anybody dial into this? You can. My experience dialing in live is you dial in and you listen. If we wanted to participate more actively, we would have to be in different shoes. We'd have to be, I believe, we'd have to be registered in a kind of investment analyst capacity, or have some other really good reason to be dialing in and be able to unmute ourselves to ask questions. But anybody can dial in. And if we go back into the database for a second, well, let's go to one of the transcripts. If we go to the top of the transcript, you can actually listen to it. Let's see what happens.
We deploy a cross-category growth strategy, which is starting to deliver on North American platform. So
you can, anybody can hear that. And that is also probably pretty easy to find on Danone's website. Why I like the Seeking Alpha platform is because I don't have to go looking into different parts of every page. I can just go to the ticker symbol and check it out. So all the information's there.
Yeah, it just aggregates everything for you. Yeah, that's great. Okay. Fascinating.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And I mean, the Danone, the example you just showed with like doing the word search, that seems quite a striking example of how things changed over those 3 years. So did you just go in and do the word search and find that immediately, or did you kind of read the full transcript start to finish and then think, hang on, the tone's changed, I think I'll go and do some searching experiments. How did you, you know, I
Yeah.
mean, I would imagine that doing a word search like that doesn't always surface something quite as obvious.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the way it happened with Danone was a bit me sort of following my nose. So let me just clarify, all 5 of the assessments I've done so far, Google, TD Bank, Danone, JBS, and Glencore, are all global companies that I think are important in their sector in some way, shape, or form, with whom I have never worked in any commercial capacity. Whereas,
Right.
I mean, you and I both know we've worked for a couple decades now in the sort of sustainability advisory world and the ESG reporting and transparency world. And so you come across a lot of companies and you get engaged as a stakeholder, as a consultant, as a third party advisor of some sort, with a lot of different companies. So I wanted to be very sure that I only picked companies that I had never worked with.
Yeah.
Danone would be one. I've worked with a number of their sector peers before. And because I'd worked with their sector peers before and been involved in benchmarking studies and taking a look at what their other sector peers were doing, I had kind of always, or not always, but I'd had my eye on Danone as an interesting company where the CEO was making pretty cool noises.
Right.
So when I undertook this assessment, I went in with, you know, it'd be really neat to look at Danone because their CEO actually says soil health in an investor earnings call. That was already on my radar because of work I had done previously. So that was my starting and my working assumption. And then when I went in, I was like, oh, wait, this has really changed, you know, because I can't follow everything all the time. I'm busy doing other things. And then when I really popped my head into Danone, I was like, oh, hang on now. Oh, he didn't say that. Oh, wait, the leadership has changed. Like it was kind of happening in real time as I was making the assessment. So there it was a bit of like serendipitous, like I've been wanting to take a closer look at this company. I'm taking a closer look. I'm following the ideas and I'm watching as the ideas morph before my eyes.
See what you mean.
Yeah.
It's coming to mind that this is that, you know, the name that you use, materiality assessment here, obviously with the different spelling, might suggest to people this is a kind of a process you go through with a set series of steps, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you come out with something that is not a materiality matrix, but it's not much different. And it feels to me it's a bit more organic than that. It's more of a lens you're applying, and going with the flow and seeing where things lead you. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's totally fair. Like I pulled this slide back up to kind of well, play a little bit of a trick on myself, because it looks now, looking at it, like, oh yeah, there's 3 columns and they're organized in relation to one another. And it shows a progression from once upon a time, the CEO said really important, grounded things, and then got, is no longer the CEO. I don't know why. So I could use words based on speculation, but I don't know why. And now the leadership doesn't say things like that. But that's kind of coincidence and kind of retroactive packaging of serendipity. And it's very true that it is more of an organic process. To be sure, when I then went to do JBS, I tried to take a similar approach, and I ran aground. I could not cohesively see the investor dialogue forming an arc. It kind of just repeated itself a bit on key ESG messaging. They were very on message. So this, I'll just blow this slide up a bit. This is from their investor earnings presentation deck, this top left rectangle here.
Yeah.
And, you know, they just kind of push those buttons over and over about what they're, if they mention ESG, that's what they mention. But then they sort of get back to how they're sort of taking over the world with protein production. And so there was no arc. So after that, I found. So after a few kind of pokings at the investor earnings calls, I began to realize the story with JBS was quite different. And I was going to be wasting my time if I just kept regurgitating investor earnings calls.
Yeah. Interesting. It's quite stark. I remember going through this assessment when you completed it and thinking, well, actually feeling quite sorry for you having had to go through all this stuff, because it seemed really painful just piecing it together. It was almost like this was like someone had put a bomb in the middle of their disclosures, and you'd gone round after the bomb had exploded and picked up the piece of paper and tried to fit them together again, versus the known one being much more of a coherent set of information that you could just dig straight into. I don't know if it's uncharitable of me to say, but it felt like there's some purposeful obfuscation going on there.
Yeah, I can't argue too strongly with you. I withhold speculative thoughts on the motives behind the mess and just try to observe the mess.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, this may seem like a funny segue, but just going into the table of contents, I'll highlight that there's an acknowledgements page where I reference the entities who've made it possible. And I really just want to zoom in on the one on page 76, which is a really incredible tree in the central neighborhood of Sao Paulo. It was one of the oldest remnants of the Atlantic forest. And I really think of this tree as a mentor. And when I started to lose my mind on this assessment, where I was like, oh my God, this one is just so convoluted, I'm going all over the place, I remembered this tree in this neighborhood and thought, okay, if they can hang on the way they've hung on, and if you could go and see this tree in person or in tree, you'd realize like, wow, I got nothing to complain about. I'm going to keep going and see what I can find.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
But you know what? It's making me think, since Danone has put out another they've had another call. They've had several since I last poked around. I thought it might be interesting to just quickly see what it looks like, because I have not looked at this one yet, right? So I'm just going to do a little, this is all I would do, is I would open it up, try soil, nope. See what happens with agriculture. Let's see what happens with sustainability. Yes, we're focused on sustainability. Raising the bar, next stage in sustainability. We're pioneers in sustainability, conviction, sustainability without performance. Yeah. So if I were reassessing, I'd start to dig a little more deeply in here and ask, like, what are you saying? You know, like,
it looks like ChatGPT came up with this one.
Yeah, totally.
Pretty anodyne.
Yeah. And to put a finer point on that, I'm not just trying to be annoying and say like, I don't like the word sustainability anymore. Let's just like take a real look at some of the findings. So, and granted that this is now a year old, but so I'm in real time, I'm not comparing if this has changed, but let's just notice what they were already saying and not backing up. They were saying 84% of their packaging as one of the highlights that they offered. That's clipped from their own report. 84% of their packaging is either recyclable, reusable, or compostable. That sounds like a really big number, although part of me is like, so you mean 16% is like guaranteed going to landfill? You're one of the largest consumer goods companies in the world, and 16% of everything you send out your factory door, can't be okay, well, let's look at the big number, 84. What happens with that? And this graph at the bottom here is from public data, and there's a link here. Anybody can go take a closer look at this if you don't like how I organize the data or you want to scrutinize it more. But let me just give you a snapshot of what's going on here. I looked at their main regions where they say, and I'll highlight where I did that, where they say they are the like leading brand. So in their own highlights here, they say like, we're big in these areas. And I took that information and I went into a deeper detailed version within their own report. And then I compared the waste data from the OECD that is public and with those regions, and looked at, well, how much is recycled? Like just stuff being recycled, whether it's branded Danone or not. And you can see the green bar in this graph is representative of, according to the OECD waste management data, the green bar is what is recycled, which in every region where they are a significant player is very low. It's either the lowest or second lowest. And the highest figure, which is in China, doesn't even reach 20%. It's barely over 10. And like, compare that to what they say in their own report, 84%, right? It just doesn't hold up.
It's astonishing, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, one other thing I want to put here and see if because I know, Geoff, you've been in so many of these conversations with so many companies really trying to kind of crack this nut. But I feel like a thing that's missing that comes up for me, and it was really relevant in this point about plastic waste, is this really, I think, broken narrative around what we might call the global south. And I know global south is a kind of also not the best term, but shorthand for the global majority, really, where most of the people in the world live, yet the most of the industrial activity and decisions are made in the global north. And what I found when I looked at how Danone talks about, and they're they're headquartered in France company, how they talked about waste in the global south. I paraphrase here, this is my own phrase where I say, why so much litter global south? But that is how it felt positioned. It's kind of like, oh, and then there's those littering people in the global south. So what's Danone doing about that? Well, they have this Novo Ciclo project, which is kind of a philanthropic litter picking up project. And, you know, I'm not opposed to philanthropy, and I'm definitely not opposed to picking up litter, but it doesn't really get at the problem. And it continues this paradigm of like, oh, they don't know how to deal with their waste there, as opposed to like, we dumped a bunch of waste on them to not deal with. And meanwhile, my experience in Brazil, where I'm fortunate to have spent a lot of time, both just as a person and as a professional, including in the waste management industry, I've seen some of the most world-class, truly circular economy type efforts there. That one example, and I link it here with Flex, which is a subsidiary of a global company. It's headquartered in the global north. But meanwhile, their Brazilian entity was just doing the most amazing things. And I was like, why don't we? And he's like, yeah, well, I guess because we're kind of not the, you know, I'm paraphrasing. I don't want to say what he meant, but my interpretation was like, because they just get on with it. They just get it done. And the folks in the global north don't even hear it. They don't get it. I thought that was a real miss.
Yeah. I think so much of what we in the global north depend upon, the first mile is in the global south, and the last mile is. Right? It's a lot of the products we consume couldn't exist without the raw materials coming from those regions, but also a lot of the waste ends up there as well. But that doesn't make a good paragraph in your sustainability report, whereas a litter program, probably with some nice glossy photos as well of people smiling,
that's right,
does wonders. No, I really like that graph. That comes back to what I was saying before, that this is about how you approach the problem rather than a set process for going through, right? Because you realize that you could go and get data beyond the company that referred to the issue the company in this case was talking about, and then you brought the two together.
I mean, there's definitely a bit of like, well, it's quite organic. And you know, just to highlight again, it's really still hard to see this, you know, here we say Latin America, you know, global south has a litter problem, but compared to the US, their recycling rates are just so much higher, right? And what's landfilled is just off the charts practically in the US. And, you know, to your point that like the first and last mile, one of the other things I did hear because what was starting to strike me is I was just sort of investigating, you know, what do they say versus what do they do? And I started to notice this pattern that, for instance, well, a lot of the ownership, and this is all from their own public disclosure. So I'm just kind of taking how they explain themselves. The ownership is the US, Europe, and the UK. That's who owns shares in the company.
Yeah.
Sales by region, kind of breaking it down again based on their numbers. So there's some blunt borders there, but it's a bit more of an even split, like who's actually eating and drinking their products. We see the rest of the world is involved a lot more. Who actually works there is a lot. I actually updated this when I first published this. I didn't find the HR numbers. I just didn't find them. They were there. They were kind of down an extra click that I didn't find. But we see that it's a bigger global majority workforce. And then who grows the ingredients, that's a question mark, but a lot of it is sugar. There's coffee, there's a whole bunch of main ingredients that I'm suddenly spacing on, but many of them are traded commodities, many of which would be in the global south. And even not knowing that, like, look at how is the company owned? How is the company eaten and consumed? And then who's doing the work? Like, it's just like, how do we understand value? It just isn't fair.
Yeah.
You know?
And as you say, this is from a company that is often held up as one of the good guys, right?
Yeah, exactly. If we look at their kind of how they position themselves, it's a pretty cheerful story. So and maybe just to bring us home a bit, I would say something you have mentioned a couple times here. I hadn't realized how important it is to this, but this isn't a kind of formulaic process. It's a question. It's what does the company say its purpose is in relation to what does it actually do? And then what does the world need from the company? And that last question is fairly subjective, but we get some really great insights. I sat down and interviewed a number of stakeholders with different perspectives to try to understand that. But really, even those first two questions, what does the company say they do and what do they actually do? That ends up being kind of telling, you know?
It reminds me of when I was looking into systems thinking and trying to find a definition of systems, and there's as many definitions of the word system as there are systems probably, but the one that always struck me as most relevant and most difficult to push back on was that the purpose of a system is what it does. And I think when you look at some of these companies and their business models and what their stated purpose is versus how they actually make money, they're a million miles apart. And for me, that in essence is what you've been doing here. You've been looking at what is it that the system, in this case the company, does versus what you would think it does based on what it says and how it says it.
Yep, that's true. And I will just note, just in case anyone's feeling a sense of despair, that I do that, but I also, in this one at least, I also, through dialogue with stakeholders and my own thinking and understanding, I didn't just grumble. I tried to offer real insights around, what would be possible if you came at this with a purpose that was in service of life. And I recognize that for most companies that really isn't their purpose, or it's not their driving purpose really. But if it were, which I think is a reasonable request of public companies that are in our fridges and on our kitchen tables, they're in our cupboards, they're in our schools, they're in all of our communities, they're in all of our fields, waterways, supply chains. Since they're there and since we're here with them, I feel like it's a reasonable thing to invite a more life-affirming purpose and then to imagine that, what would that be? So that's what I aim to do with this.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's where this really comes together for me. If you were just criticizing, then anyone can do that, right? But you're teeing up, here's the alternative. And I don't think anyone would argue that you're saying the alternative is easy when you're contributing to an economic system with, we saw the comment on the slide from the investor pushing back on Danone CEO on one of those that 2019 statement. So we're operating in a system that is not currently valuing the suggestions you're putting, but it's very hard to argue that they're the wrong suggestions.
Yeah.
And that in itself should trigger different conversations.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your questions. And I'm going to just, as a little bonus at the end here, speaking of questions, signal that at the end of each transcript, you can see the questions. So I find it really actually fascinating to look at what questions are being asked. And if you get into it enough, you can start to see that the same investor will ask, like, they've got themes that they're digging into, and some of them are just about the money. And then some of them really are about some of the stresses and tensions and practicalities that veer into areas that I'm kind of more excited to hear about. So it's all there.
That's interesting. Does it say who those investors are affiliated with?
Yeah. So right off the top, we see who's there, and you can look these folks up. They're usually listed somewhere within those companies or on LinkedIn. I didn't hear back from any, but ahead of the JBS quarterly or annual earnings call, actually, I tagged the investors who'd been calling into the recent ones. I tagged them on LinkedIn and sent them a link to the JBS assessment. I don't know if they looked. I don't know if it was useful, but it was really intending to inform questions. That earnings call, there was nothing about ESG, like 0 keywords. And for sure, I don't know this for a fact, but my sense is somebody at JBS would have seen the assessment before the call. Because it was public, it's being public, and people knew that I was working on it, but I don't know anybody directly at JBS. I haven't heard. I genuinely welcome feedback and questions and corrections, of course.
Yeah.
But I haven't heard back. So, but yeah, you can check in with any of those folks.
It strikes me you could switch this around, and you could, I don't know how easy the platform would enable this, Seeking Alpha or in other ways, but you could, for example, pick JP Morgan or Barclays or whatever, and you could look at what are the, how many of these quarterly calls are they attending, asking questions, what proportion of those questions are around sustainability, and then what proportion of those questions are pushing the company to do more versus challenging the fact that the company is already doing something. And so effectively doing a materiality assessment of the investors that are investing in and supposedly pushing these companies to do more. That would be, I'm not suggesting you do this, but I think it would be super interesting. The information is there. It might be harder to collate together because it's not framed that way round, but
that's right.
It'd be doable.
I love that idea. Actually, let's just see if it's searchable on an investor name. Yeah, you can.
There you go.
Look at that.
Fantastic.
He's dialing into lots of the consumer goods. Yeah, that's a really cool idea. And so just to daydream for a moment on that, what I would hope to get from that is an understanding of the types of questions investors are asking, the types of answers that come up, and then again, ground it in what's needed. Like what would help. And at the moment, I'm not deluding myself too much in thinking what I think is needed is something that's suddenly going to be of interest to investors and they're going to push on that. I understand that a lot of this is about de-risking portfolio. It's about you know, managing a whole suite of investments and looking at direction of travel, mostly financially. So nonetheless, I think it's more than reasonable to imagine a point in time where it would be common sense to wonder out loud and expect real data in response that helps us see that this company is serving life. And so, yeah, that's really, I hadn't thought of that. I like that we can look that up. Thanks for that question. Cool. Well, I'm going to wind us up here. Thank you, Geoff, for your questions, and look forward to future questions as well. But for now, I'll bring us home and pause the recording. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.